Hey, groupers. Well, Psalm 100 and the end of this interruption in our regularly scheduled programs. We're going to start Hebrews when I get back from my backpacking trip. Psalm 100, Icebreaker. Whose mom made you write thank you letters for your birthday presents, for your Christmas gifts when you were growing up? And do you make your kids write thank you cards for their gifts? Do you still write thank you cards for gifts you receive? And then, on that same note, do you think that there's value in writing a thank you card even if you don't mean it? Is there value? And what are the benefits of writing a thank you card if you don't mean it? And what are the problems? Does it do damage to write a thank you card if you don't mean it? Well, the psalmist lists qualities, characteristics of God that he says would lead us to a place of worship. Make a list. Just go through this short psalm. Make a list of the qualities, the characteristics of God that would lead us to worship. And then he also makes a list of some expressions of worship in this psalm. And so I'm wondering, how can these shape the way that we worship God? Do you see these expressions of worship in your life and our church life? And how might we shape our worship around this psalm? Now in verses 1 and 2, the psalmist uses the word joy and gladness and joyful. If someone were to visit our church and look at the faces of our worshipers, listen to our songs, and pick up the feelings of the gathered, do you think that they would describe the atmosphere of our church as joy, gladness, joyful? How do you think that we could bring more of this into our worship? Now in verse 3, the psalmist calls us sheep. First, just be honest. How does that make you feel? How does it make you feel to be called a sheep? And why do you think that the psalmist uses this metaphor so often to describe the people of God? How are we like sheep? Well, then the psalmist says in verse 3 that we are to know God. Very important in our worship, he says. So the question I have for you is, how does knowing God help shape our worship? Why does the psalmist tell us to know God in this context of worship? Why this intellectual part to this emotional expression? Well, the psalmist finishes with hesed language, which means God's love endures forever. That's what hesed means. How has God been faithful to you? And then, how has God been faithful to our church, the Lakeside Christian Church? Well, finally, the application, we want to talk about getting our eyes on God and getting them off of our great challenges. If we're going to have consistent joy, then we have to keep our eyes on God. So just an application to remind you to immerse yourself in God during this great time of crisis, and you will maintain your joy. It's the best chance you have. I look forward to seeing you after my backpacking trip. God bless.